Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to address you all one more time. I propose the State of the Union, and this time it is about the realms of defense economics. An issue of great national signification, especially in contemporary times. Actually, it all started way back in 1990 when I was a graduate student in the United States, and in the summer of 1990 we had the Gulf War, perhaps the most televised war in the world at that point in time. So almost everyone anywhere got a ball by ball account of what was going on. The Arab Monetary Fund, in the after event of the war, pegged the actual cost at 620 billion US dollars. This was the actual cost. The amount Saudi Arabia and Kuwait paid the United States and allies like the United Kingdom, building of airfields, weapon systems, acquisition of weapon systems, so on and so forth. Still later in 1992, in a well-documented article in the New York Times, this number was reiterated. Now, just to put things in perspective, in the spring of 1993, the World Bank expended and partly invested a tiny sum of money, but nowhere near $620 billion. This was defrayed in sub-Saharan Africa, and by the spring of 1997, the fruits were there for all to see. In fact, a quick back-of-the-envelope calculation revealed to me that had the 620 billion US dollars been spent on sub-Saharan African region, the four verticals of healthcare, agriculture, education and infrastructure would have been very well taken care of, and today sub-Saharan Africa would be a far more developed place. So the bottom line being that wars cost a lot of money, and sometimes it raises intergenerational issues. So it is in all our interests to work towards global peace. So anyways, my interest in defense economics was kindled no end, and I started researching on the defense economics of two large democracies, the United States and India. Suffice to state that this articulation would be on the defense economics of India per se. It would cover a region, it would cover a timeline of 1947 to 2017, and region-wise it would cover many issues in the subcontinent per se. So let's begin. In 1947, when India attained her independence, the first Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, inherited an economic mess. For starters, for over 100 years the British had looted India, and at the time of independence, to add insult to injury, India had to pay what was then a whopping amount of money to the state of Pakistan. The then Prime Minister of India had very few options in terms of economic models to adopt. After much deliberation, he chose the format of Fabian socialism. Well, there was a lot of deliberation which went into this. In fact, even if you were to research the Constituent Assembly debates and so on and so forth, several research articles which appeared during that period. The establishment at that time considered a few models, but given that India had major restraints and constraints, the establishment settled for this. Now, it has been premised by many that India started off on a wrong foot. In fact, over the last 10 to 20 years, this ideation has gained much traction. But my own research, which is respectfully submitted, was that the Indian Prime Minister at that point in time did not have too many options. Therefore, he went in for Fabian socialism. In fact, this period from 47 to 2017, I have documented with 36 research articles, and it is contained in an anthology. So as part of that exercise, I engaged in this research. Now, having stated that, the fact remains that the first Prime Minister of India chose Fabian socialism, and in doing so, he took a cautious approach going forward. Another point here which I must stress on is that in the first half of the last century, in the period leading up to independence, India had a lot of issues. There was drought in various areas, the Bengal famine of the 30s, civil unrest, and the British had hardly invested anything in our infrastructure. There was nothing to talk about in terms of major industry, or for that matter, any big irrigation project. So it was in this gory scenario that the first Prime Minister of India inherited an economy. Anyways, in keeping with the dictates of Fabian socialism, the then Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, went in and effectuated a planning commission, since one of the core characteristics of Fabian socialism is centralized plans. And as a corollary, there were major public sector undertakings incubated. The third feature of Fabian socialism is that of high levels of taxation, and the fourth feature is of high levels of regulation. Now, this first part of the narrative, I will talk about a period from 1947 to 1991, when India was firmly in the grip of Fabian socialism. The second part, as we went ahead to other formats, I will discuss at a later stage. So, the Planning Commission, the chairman of the first Planning Commission was Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, and the deputy or the vice chairman of the Planning Commission was Sir V.T. Krishnamachari, who had previously been the Diwan of Baroda and the Diwan of Jaipur, and a member of the Constituent Assembly. Diwan equates to a Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister of the princely states of Baroda and Jaipur, and then a member of the Constituent Assembly. So the first 3 5-year plans, so almost 15 years, were largely dedicated towards effectuating progressive measures in agriculture, agro-based industries, rural industries. As we moved on to the second and third plan, a wee bit of infrastructure. In the third plan, we had an emphasis on post and telegraphs, what telecom was called then, and stuff like that. And the entire emphasis was on effectuating on welfareism per se, food, clothing, and basic shelter. And to that effect, the entire period when Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru ruled this country from 1947 till 1964, he actually believed that India should achieve a certain amount of economic verve so that welfareism can be effectuated on. This was his genuine belief, and he worked towards it. This is actually reiterated by a research initiative of a Swedish economist called Professor Carl Gunnar Myrdal. 1947 to 1967 was his period of study, which largely coincided with the stewardship of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. And in this period, after a meticulous study, the Swedish economists pointed out that the underlying emphasis of the Indian economic narrative was on trying to achieve welfarism, and that there were two huge albatrosses: income stroke wealth and gender inequality. Moving on, after a brief period of Lal Bahadur Shastri, Mrs. Gandhi continued literally on the same verb. Of course, she had additional issues to deal with: social unrest, war with Pakistan, so on and so forth. Nonetheless, she went on the same genre. In fact, in certain measures were more stringent, because at one point in time she was even supported by the communists to be in power. And after her passing away, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi's stewardship, in fact even the plan which coincided with the stewardship, the emphasis was on industrialization. The baby steps were taken so that employment would not become a sore issue. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi recognized that, and there was a key emphasis on that, and the creation of certain industries and so on and so forth. 89 to 91, we had a curious golem of fraud of people and parties in this country, and but the genre was more or less maintained. But it was in 1991, due to the extenuating circumstances, that the brilliance of Narasimha Rao emerged, and India moved from Fabian socialism to liberalization. As we liberalized, the growth story started happening. What was an average of 3 and below 3 moved on to 6, and towards the end of his 5-year term almost became 8.25, and this was brilliantly built on by A.B. Vajpayee, who kept the traction very strong, and it was moving forward. India was indeed shining, and after he demitted office, in the 10 years of Manmohan Singh, UPA 1 gained largely due to the brilliant periods of Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee. UPA 2 was a disaster, both in terms of planning and economic achievement per se. In Modi 1.0, there was a tacit shift from liberalization to laissez-faire economics, where the emphasis was on minimizing the size of government. Nonetheless, the growth story remained tepid, and Modi 2.0 is anyway work in progress. Of course, in his first term, he did away with the Planning Commission and bottled the National Institution for the Transformation of India, which I believe was a good move, looking back. So, pretty much the 70-year economic narrative of India, and the first major characteristic of Fabian socialism was incubating these centralized plans, and this is how it worked out. The second option, and the second characteristic rather, with the Fabian socialism was the creation of PSUs. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru recognized this. In fact, I should state here that a number of Indian economists of the time, V.K. Ramaswamy, Sukhumai Chakrabarti, still later Amartya Sen, they were all schooled in the ideation of J.M. Keynes. So, Fabian socialism fit in perfectly, and Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru incubated many PSUs. In fact, many ordnance factories today we have beyond 42 were all incubated at that point in time. some of the big defense PSUs like the HAL and all that started at that point in time. And fundamentally, the ideation was to create large PSUs so that employment would be generated, and it would be another progressive step towards achieving welfareism. So, and then if you go back into the third characteristic, which is about high levels of taxation, the entire period from 47 till Rajiv Gandhi's budget in 85, India had unreasonable levels of taxation in keeping with Fabian socialism. Nonetheless, it was Rajiv Gandhi who really made this shift towards industrialization, and he realized that we have to bring down the levels of taxes. This was reflected in his 85 budget, and of course, with the coming in of Narasimha Rao and Vajpayee, the entire thing, went southward. Taxes started coming down and down, and in fact, this was enabling, and in fact, till 2017, there has been a pronounced move by the establishment to rationalize the taxes, and of course, we also brought in shortly thereafter at that point in time it was toyed in, and then immediately afterwards it was the GST came into being, which again was a very progressive move and will do a lot of good for Indian economy. And now to the fourth characteristic, which is about regulation. The entire period of Fabian socialism, we had license Raj, license permit, everything was under quota. Liberalization made the tacit move, and now with Modi, with laissez-faire, it's minimizing government is the emphasis, so that markets become freer and freer. In fact, thanks to Narasimha Rao, there were a lot of good moves made vis-a-vis foreign exchange, and I believe now that the day is not far off when India goes fully convertible even on the capital account. So pretty much this is the 70-year narrative of the Indian economy. And now let me go back to 1947. In the immediate aftermath of independence, India had a Pashtun invasion backed by the violent venal state of Pakistan. Immediately, of course, we were able to handle that rather easily, but in the immediate aftermath of that, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru commissioned a Nobel Prize winner in physics to come up with a blueprint, apropos India's weapon systems, what we have to acquire and what we need to do centric to defense preparedness. Professor Blackett went about doing his job in a very meticulous way, but at some point in time, he realized that we should not spend over a particular number, and he pegged this number at 2% of our GDP. Now, this had some consequences, which I will talk about later. But if you go into the entire defense expenditure of India, both capital and revenue, for the 70-year period, apart from the periods where we had skirmishes and wars, the Pashtun invasion, the 65 war with Pakistan, the 71 war with Pakistan, the 62 war with China, the Goa Liberation War, the Siachen issue under the stewardship of Rajiv Gandhi, and the Kargil War. In the immediate aftermath of these skirmishes stroke wars, defense spending was spiked up. This was pronounced after the Chinese war, when JN really pushed up the ante in terms of defense expenditure. In the mid-80s, when Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi was there and we had the Siachen issue again, there was a spike. And after the 71 war as well. So after every war we have spiked, but otherwise we have remained very true to Professor Blackett's recommendation of 2 or less percent, 2% or less of the GDP with defense expenditure. So this had some issues, something which I will talk about later when I discuss the albatrosses. So suffice to state that the entire narrative of the 70-year narrative in terms of defense expenditure was contained for a large periods under 2%. As an indicative archetype, the entire 10 years of Manmohan Singh, followed by Modi 1.0, it was all under 2%. Modi 2.0 anyway is work in progress, and this anthology of mine covered only a period till 2017. So suffice to state, India has 11 albatrosses, and as part of this articulation I will deal with the 4 major albatrosses apropos India's defense economics per se. The first is theoretical, largely theoretical economics, and it is all about the GDP. Now let me explain. The GDP as we know it came into being in the war era, when the United States administration wanted a yardstick to measure the economy. They hired Professor Simon Kuznets, who came up with this yardstick called GDP. At that time, the United States had a manufacturing base and had a agricultural base as well. Agricultural produce was good. So the GDP per se was reflective of this scenario. But in the Internet of Everything age, where almost 80% of some economies are governed by the service verticals, the GDP does not reflect that in its fullest verb. This is an aberration which needs to go. As an indicative archetype, France under Emmanuel Macron has moved on to a wellness index, wherein the 6 major macroeconomic markets are studied independently and then collectively, and issues like standard of living and the effect of climate change are all taken into account. So therefore the wellness index will provide for a holistic and a totalitarian perspective of the real health of an economy. Unfortunately, we haven't got there as yet in India, and we need to do that real quick. Now, why is this an albatross? For 2 reasons. One, it is not a perfect measure of the economic scenario or of the health of an economy. And 2, it gives incumbent governments anywhere the ability to indulge in trickery, subterfuges. An incumbent government anywhere, by merely moving the base year, can make its performance look that much better, even though the reality could be in contradistinction. This has to change. As an addendum, and again in the relevance of numbers and the numerical sciences, along with this problem with the GDP, there have been several mathematicians who have worked on the GDP using various Lagrangian equations, endogenous and exogenous variables. Now here I see a huge albatross, and let me explain this slowly. You see, one of the greatest economic treatises I have read is the Arthashastra of Chanakya, entirely based on the nuances of logic per se. In the first half of the last century, Lionel Robbins, widely considered to be the father of the modern economic sciences, clearly articulated that logical underpinnings ought to drive economic reasoning, and that math and stat are only enabling tools. Rather sardonically, in the 1960s in New England, in the United States, a whole bunch of wannabe and failed mathematicians got into enormous amount of reasoning while using the techniques of mathematics, and in fact the GDP was their favorite topic, and they came up with several mathematical models. In fact, many of them even wrote in great journals like the American Economic Review. But my research indicated that they hardly had any pragmatic signification, because logic was clearly given the bypass. Just to reiterate this point, in 1996, a working paper at a premier school in London, a group of 12, 6 mathematical economists and 6 janitors were taken, and a period was from 92 to 95. And the 6 macroeconomic coordinates, the 2 subgroups, that is of janitors and of mathematical economists, were made to prognosticate. And almost every quarter, the janitors were nearer the mark than the mathematical economists. I'm not debunking math's role, but the reality is that math and stat can be used to corroborate and reiterate, because they are not economics. Economics is an independent field which is based on logic and requires sound reasoning. Math and stat certainly are required, but that's just to corroborate and reiterate and nothing more. So this is a big albatross, and this is one of the reasons why today on the same matter, 5 economists have 5 different views, and each one of them substantiates his view with some kind of a publication. And unfortunately, even when the publication is not built on rock solid foundation, his reasoning to that extent suffers. So this has to change. And so Defense Economics of India, when there were several models done based on our GDP, it suffered from the same problems. So we have to get back to logical ways in terms of understanding economic problems and in terms of finding solutions for them. The second albatross in the realms of political economics, and let me be very clear here, geopolitics and geoeconomics are here to stay. The United Nations Security Council, in my very humble opinion, have not done a great job when it comes to certain developing nations. As an exemplar, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council have at various points in time ignored India's genuine concerns. 2 of the members have openly supported Pakistan from the 50s, from the time of General Yahya Khan, by either funding or in effectuating technology transfers. And as a direct consequence of this, India had to suffer. Indian economics, defense economics had to suffer, because we had to spend that much more as a reaction. Remember, I started this narrative with the exemplar of the Gulf War. So this additional expenditure that India had to repeatedly incur was at the cost of development per se, and therefore the United Nations Security Council, in my humble opinion, has been an albatross apropos India's political economy. Now, the League of Nations, which was the precursor to the United Nations, was built on the very basis that we have to be a multipolar world. And here I'll have to state that the greatest contribution of Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru to India and to the world at large was that he incubated the non-aligned movement, which by its very definition had regional economies and would have enabled an egalitarian world order. No country or a junta or a group could have got to a dominant position and then drive hard bargains, which is what the world is characterized by today. We need to move ahead and get to an egalitarian order. And for starters, if you're still going to continue with the UN system, India deserves a place in the UN Security Council. We are a very mature nation and a nation which has always worked on the principles of ahimsa in terms of foreign policy. Third albatross, apropos defense economics of India, is the 2% rule set by Professor Blackett. Now, I read the report of Professor Blackett, and it was very clear that the central ideation was about our defense expenditure in terms of capital acquisition programs, and unfortunately, the Ministry of Defense, which is made up of a number of bureaucrats, tweaked this. Therefore, the 2% rule included both capital and revenue expenditure. Well, I have to state here that the Indian soldiers are the best in the world. It has been said by many at various points in time that given a British general and the American weapon systems will be invincible. Nonetheless, the 2% rule has served as an albatross because almost every general or chief of staff or vice chief of staff who has testified before parliamentary standing committees in India, they all have enunciated that we need to spend more on capital account, capital account and in acquisitions per se, because we require sophisticated weapon systems. It's as simple as that. Now, the first point about the albatross, I spoke about mathematical economies. Now, let me say something here. This 3% rule, given what I have clearly articulated on the GDP, is to be used simply as a ideation, as a yardstick. The bottom line being we need to spend much more money. Now let's assume that we get into a wellness index. There's a very easy way to raise revenue for this. I just spoke of mathematical economists. Now some of the mathematical economists in India, well, based primarily on what they studied and all the economic models which built up their ideation, have even made statements like we have to do away with taxation in this country. In my very humble opinion, nothing can be a more fanfare exercise, simply because we need to get a perspicacious and a pragmatic solution. The way forward is simple. All we have to do to handle this issue of getting to spend more for capital account vis-a-vis our defense expenditure is that we have to incubate two councils, a Defense Technical Council and a Defense Acquisition Council. The Defense Technical Council should comprise of eminent scientists in Army, Navy and Air Force personnel, accomplished people who can ideate from a medium to long-term perspective as to what our weapon systems ought to be. And then the Defense Acquisition Council takes over. They have to find the ways and means of raising the monies. Let me give you an example here. I did a research in 2016 before writing the anthology, a sample base of 1,000 people, all taxpayers. Excuse me. At that point in time, the findings were simple. Should the taxation rates be lowered, 15 to 18% they said for income tax, and 21% for corporate tax without riders, there would be much more compliance. And what we have to do is to expand the tax base by coming up with a simple formula. Everybody above poverty line, even if we were to assume that to be 200 million people, if they were to pay 1,000 rupees a year as a slab amount, this would go on to increase our revenues substantially. My calculations at that point in time revealed 4.2 times more. And this would, in effect, give us that much more money to spend on defense acquisition programs, much more than the proverbial 3% rule, which a bunch of intellectuals in India have been articulating since 1959. And we will even have for other issues like infrastructure and in effectuating on welfareism per se. So we need to be perspicacious about raising money and pragmatic about it as well. Do away with mathematical models which make no sense at all. In fact, I have been in a conference a few years ago where, after cranking out all the Lagrangian equations, a group of us were trying to figure out what the economics was. This is the realm of economics. As I want to repeat again, math and stat are enabling tools. That's about it, period. So we have to do away with this albatross of 2% rule, move on to a more pragmatic and perspicacious rule, which I have enunciated. And final albatross of India's defense economics, major albatross. The sardonic truth is that from 1947 till 2017, from the Jeep scandal, which broke out in 1948, to Rafael, no deal has been seen to be above board. A very classified research initiative of mine indicated that anywhere between 5 to 7.5% is paid. Of course, this number is in the realm of conjecture. Many whom I interviewed did not want to come on record. Suffice to state, there cannot be smoke without fire. Various publications have also referred to this, but numbers, be they what they were or what they are, one thing is for certain: corruption has been endemic. And this is an area where we have to work on, because corruption directly causes adverse results for defense economics. One, we pay more and get less. And second, there's always an inevitable delay. It causes defense preparedness issues. And when planning does not happen in a meticulous manner and things are sudden, we end up spending that much more. So we have to do away with this albatross, excuse me, and there are, there are exemplars from around the world where we can learn from. Finland, Sweden, even the US at times have incubated councils as part of their defense acquisition programs. Like I've just said in the previous point, the defense acquisition councils, they can have an ethical wing wherein 30 or 40 extremely ethical, well-heeled dignitaries in India can come on board and ideate on a no-names basis apropos the acquisition initiatives. This will ensure zero tolerance to corruption, and it will give us that much more money and make our defense economics that much more robust. So if we do away with these four albatrosses, India will be on a firm footing. We will once again get to a very strong economy and a strong defense force, and this will enable us to usher in global egalitarianism. All these points and more are contained in my anthology. My anthology is reflective of the popular notions, and it indeed contains the economic narrative of India vis-a-vis her defense verticals for a 70-year period, 1947 to 2017. Please read the anthology. Jai Hind.